Okay, so like you hear that phrase, right? Once a Marine, always a Marine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe the Marines hymn, that just stirs something inside you.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going all the way back today to like the very beginnings,
Yeah.
the origins of the United States Marine Corps.
Right to the start.
We've got some pretty cool historical accounts and expert insight.
Had a lot of good stuff here, yeah.
And your mission, if you choose to accept it,
Okay.
is to really understand how this legendary fighting force came to be.
It's a great story.
It is. It is.
Yeah, so to get there, I think we've got a really good mix of sources today.
Well,
there's a YouTube documentary transcript that gives a pretty good overview
okay.
of the history of the Marine Corps.
Broad strokes.
Broad strokes,
Right.
exactly. And then we have this really interesting article from military.com that really zones in on the establishment date.
It's specific.
Very specific, yeah. And then, of course, we have the Wikipedia entry on Marine Corps history.
Always comprehensive.
Incredibly
Double.
detailed. Incredibly detailed. We'll pull out the best parts for you.
Right, and not get too bogged down.
Exactly. Exactly.
So yeah, by the end of this this deep dive,
Yeah.
you'll know the important events,
Mm-hmm.
the motivations, the key players,
Oh, the good stuff.
all the good stuff. Yeah, and in the Marine Corps birth,
It's a good one.
it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
From their initial formation during the Revolutionary War,
Right.
all the way through the establishment of the modern Corps,
Mhm.
and why they were needed.
Why were they there in the first place?
Right, those early defining moments,
Yeah.
and the traditions that really took root in those formative years.
Those traditions are really interesting, I think.
They are fascinating how they evolve.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Okay.
It's interesting that the idea of Marines, soldiers serving on ships,
Yeah.
isn't this unique American thing?
Right.
This concept actually goes way back.
It goes way back.
Fascinating.
It does. It does. We see examples in ancient Greece and Rome.
That's pretty far back.
It is. Yeah, it's interesting to see how that idea has evolved over time.
Right.
But if you think more recently, the British had their own naval infantry
Oh, yeah.
back in the 17th century.
Sure.
But here's a really cool tidbit from the research.
Okay.
In 1739, there was this conflict between Britain and Spain,
Mm-hmm.
and King George II called for more Marine units.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those regiments, this was largely drawn from American colonists.
Really?
Yeah, so we're talking like 30 companies, 100 men each,
Wow.
from most of the colonies in America.
That's pretty wise.
So you have Americans serving as British Marines decades before there even was a U.S.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
That puts things in a whole new perspective, doesn't it?
It does.
So it wasn't like completely foreign, this idea, when it came time for the U.S. to create its own force.
Right. They had experience in that kind of role.
Yeah.
Yeah, James Fenimore Cooper.
Oh, yeah.
He was one of the early historians of the U.S. Navy,
He was, yeah.
and he gave this really good description. He said that Marines were strictly infantry soldiers who are trained to serve afloat, and their discipline, equipments, character, and esprit de corps are altogether those of an army.
Right.
Very clear definition.
Yeah. And he really emphasized their importance on a warship.
Right. So why are they there?
Yeah. Why are they there? Exactly.
Yeah.
What are they doing?
Yeah.
And he says, they're providing security, and they're sentries,
Mm-hmm.
they're repelling enemy borders, and they're actually even maintaining order among the crew.
Keeping things in line.
Yeah. So if we connect this to the bigger picture,
Mm-hmm.
you can really see that early vision for these early Marines was very specific.
Yeah.
They're a highly disciplined land force
Mm-hmm.
that's directly supporting naval operations.
Absolutely.
And Cooper even argued that during the Revolutionary War,
Okay.
Marines were perhaps more important.
Than at any other point in naval history.
Wow.
And really being that crucial element in preserving ships, because they were putting down any unruly behavior among the sailors.
Right. So they're not just fighting the enemy, they're also keeping their own guys in line.
Exactly. Yeah. They're enforcers
Yeah.
and stabilizers
Yeah.
within the context of the Navy.
It's a tough job.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And so it was in the heat of the American Revolution that the spark for the U.S. Marines really ignited.
Right.
So November 1775, the Continental Congress makes a decision to raise 2 battalions of Marines.
Big moment.
Big moment, yeah. And the key requirement for anybody that wanted to join
Okay.
was that they be good seamen or so acquainted with maritime affairs as to be able to serve to advantage by sea when required.
Right, they need to know what they're doing.
They got to know what they're doing.
On a ship.
They're signing up to serve for the duration of the war against Great Britain.
So this raises a question for me.
Okay.
Why even create a separate Marine force at all?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Why not just put Army soldiers on ships?
Right?
But when you look at that emphasis on good seamen or knowledge of maritime affairs,
Right.
it's really telling.
It is.
It really suggests they knew they needed people familiar with being at sea.
It's a different environment.
It's a very different environment.
For sure, yeah.
And that early distinction is going to be huge going forward.
Huge, yeah. So these new units were officially designated as the 1st and 2nd Battalions of American Marines.
Okay.
And on November 28th, 1775, Congress commissioned Samuel Nicholas as their first Marine officer,
Okay.
with the rank of
There's
captain.
Nicholas.
He's traditionally considered the first commandant of the Marine Corps,
Interesting.
even though that specific title didn't exist quite yet.
So he's laying the groundwork
He was laying the groundwork.
for that whole role.
For sure.
It's interesting. They actually had a little bit of a discussion back then about whether the Marines should be part of the Continental Army. But they decided very quickly to keep them as independent units.
So that naval connection was right there from the start.
Right there from the start.
Yeah, and it allowed them to cultivate their own identity and their own specialized skill set.
Tailored to naval operations.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
So Captain Nicholas gets to work.
Yeah.
Immediately, he starts recruiting.
It's those guys.
Got to get those guys. And two places become really important in these early efforts.
Okay.
Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, you might have heard of that.
Yeah.
And his own family's Conestoga Wagon Tavern.
Wow. So he's using his connections.
Exactly, he's using his connections.
Good for him.
By the end of December 1775,
Okay.
just a month or so later,
Mm-hmm.
they've already recruited about 300 men into 5 companies.
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, Marine privates at this time were paid $6 2/3 a month.
Okay.
And kind of like the sailors, they were promised a share of any prize money from captured ships.
Oh, so they could get a bonus.
A bonus, yeah.
Nice.
That must have been a pretty good incentive,
Oh, I bet.
to join up.
Yeah. But you know what's really striking when you look at this period?
What's that?
They had so much trouble just getting the basic stuff.
Like what?
Well, recruiting the men, that was one thing. But
Yeah.
arming them and clothing them, oh man, that was a huge hurdle.
Really?
Yeah, the Continental Congress, they were struggling financially,
Sure.
and they just didn't have the funds or the weapons available.
Wow.
So the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety, they had to equip the Marines,
Mm-hmm.
and even they were coming up short.
So what did they do?
They actually had to put out a public plea to the counties to see if they could find any arms.
Wow. Talk about starting from scratch.
Really starting from scratch.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the weapons.
Oh, so what else?
Uniforms were a problem, too.
Oh, really?
The colonial textile industry, they were already trying to keep up with the Continental Army.
Right. Yeah.
So the Navy and the Marines, they had to wait like a year before they got proper uniforms.
Wow.
So, they're starting with basically nothing.
Talk about resourcefulness being baked into the Corps from day one.
Right, from day one.
Right.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Even with all those problems, they didn't have to wait long for action.
Really? They jumped right in.
They jumped right in.
Wow.
The U.S. Marines have this huge reputation for their amphibious assaults, right?
Yes.
And it's amazing because within 4 months of that resolution that created them,
Mm-hmm.
they carried out their first offensive amphibious operation
Really?
in January 1776.
That is amazing.
Yeah, there was a colonial newspaper that even reported on this initial action.
Wow.
It really marks the very beginning of their long history.
In this very specific
Amphibic. Yeah.
and very challenging type of warfare.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then on March 3, 1776, they made their first amphibious landing
Okay.
during the Battle of Nassau in the Bahamas.
Mm-hmm.
Although it wasn't like a complete surprise attack.
Right.
But it speaks to their purpose and their rapid deployment.
Yeah, they were ready to go.
Yeah, they were ready to go. And then the Revolutionary War ends,
Yeah.
and the Continental Marines, along with the Continental Navy,
Mm-hmm.
they're disbanded.
It makes sense.
Right.
You know, war's over.
War's over.
We don't need them.
Time to move on.
It
But that didn't last, did it?
didn't last, no.
I mean, the need for a naval fighting force came back pretty quickly.
Yeah, they realized pretty fast that they needed that naval presence.
Yeah.
Especially with the quasi-war with France coming up.
Right, right.
So what happens?
What happens?
Congress, they create the United States Navy.
Okay.
And they formally reestablish the Marine Corps with the Act for Establishing and Organizing a Marine Corps.
Okay.
President John Adams signs that into law on July 11, 1798.
Okay.
This act authorized a battalion of 500 privates led by a major.
So who was that first major?
So the very next day, William Ward Burroughs I is appointed to that rank.
Okay, so while that formal reestablishment was in 1798,
Right.
the Marine Corps celebrates its birthday is November 10th of 1775.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that date commemorates the original resolution by the Continental Congress.
So they're going back to that original spark.
That original spark that's important to them.
Yeah.
And that tradition of celebrating that date was standardized in 1921.
Okay.
Before that, they actually observed it on July 11th.
Oh, so they switched it up.
They switched it up.
Interesting.
Yeah, it shows how much importance they place on that initial creation during the Revolutionary War.
That's right. The military.com article we have really highlights that they celebrated on July 11th from 1799 until 1921 when they made the decision to permanently shift it to November 10th.
So that really was a conscious choice.
Yeah, a conscious choice to honor that moment in 1775.
And that annual observance with the birthday ball and the cake-cutting ceremony.
All the traditions.
All the traditions, right? It really reminds them
of where they came from.
Of their history, for sure.
Yeah.
So the reestablished Marines, they're thrown right back into action.
Okay. Right into the fire.
They see early service during the Quasi-War and the first Barbary War against the Barbary pirates from 1801 to 1805.
A lot going on.
A lot going on, yeah. And there's this particularly famous,
Okay.
almost legendary event from this period.
No, tell me about it.
The daring expedition led by General William Eaton and First Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon.
So what's so special about this mission?
Oh, it's audacious.
Really?
Their objective was to cross the Egyptian desert.
Wow.
And ultimately capture the city of Tripoli.
That's ambitious.
Ambitious.
Yeah.
The goal was to get back the crew of the captured USS Philadelphia.
Ah, okay.
And while they only made it as far as Dern, which is a city east of Tripoli, this action became immortalized in the Marines' hymn.
Okay.
The line to the shores of Tripoli.
Oh, yeah.
Shows their bravery and their determination.
Yeah, facing those odds.
Facing incredible odds,
Yeah, that line in the hymn, it's not just poetry.
It's not.
Prince Hamid Karamanli. He was the exiled ruler of Tripoli. He was so impressed by Lieutenant O'Bannon's courage and the Marines at Dern, he gave him a Mameluke sword.
As a gift?
As a sign of respect.
Wow.
Yeah. And that sword became the sword for all Marine officers in 1825.
That's amazing.
And it's still used today.
It's a real link back to those early missions.
Absolutely.
And the bravery.
Yeah, it's like a physical reminder of that history.
It really is.
Yeah.
So this period also sees the emergence of some of the Marine Corps' most recognizable traditions.
Okay. Like?
Well, for example, the nickname leathernecks.
Leathernecks?
Where does that come from?
Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from this stiff leather stock that was worn around the neck.
Okay.
By both American and British Marines starting in 1798.
Around the neck?
Yeah, it was a nearly 3.5-inch high leather collar.
Oh, wow.
And it was mostly for dress and to, promote a more upright military bearer.
But they had to stand up straight.
Yeah, I bet it was uncomfortable.
Oh, I bet.
I read that one general later said it made them look like geese searching for rain.
Oh, no.
They eventually dropped it from the uniform in 1872.
Yeah.
But the nickname stuck.
Leathernecks.
Leathernecks.
I love it.
It's a great example of how even a practical uniform item can turn into a lasting symbol.
Right, a symbol of their identity.
Exactly, yeah.
So another big thing that happened around this time, the United States Marine Band, officially formed on July 11, 1798.
Okay.
Same day that President Adams signed the act to reestablish the Corps.
No kidding?
Yeah, so they get going really quickly and they get a really good reputation.
They're good.
And Thomas Jefferson asks them to play at his inauguration.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they've played at every inauguration since then.
Every single one.
Yeah, and that's where they get the nickname.
What's that?
The President's Own.
The President's Own.
Yeah.
From Thomas Jefferson himself.
From Thomas Jefferson himself.
That's amazing.
And then later on under John Philip Sousa.
Oh, yeah, the
legend who led them from 1880 to 1892. They're really elevated.
He made them the best.
He turned them into the nation's premier military band.
Right.
And he led their first national concert tour.
So he really got them out there.
He got them out there, yeah.
Yeah. What's really cool, too, is that the Marine Band was one of the first to make phonograph recordings.
They were pioneers in music preservation.
That's right, yeah.
That's amazing.
It is.
Yeah, so this period also sets up that close relationship
Yeah,
between the Marine Corps and the Navy.
of course.
They were kind of considered part of the Department of the Navy from that 1798 reestablishment.
Mm-hmm.
But that connection was made official with the Act for the Better Organization of the United States Marine Corps in 1834.
Okay.
And that formally made them a sister service,
So they're part of the same family?
part of the same family
Okay.
within the Department of the Navy.
Yeah, that's a relationship that has shaped them ever since.
It really has, yeah.
Yeah.
So you've just traveled through those early chapters of the U.S. Marine story.
What a journey.
What a journey, yeah. From the need for soldiers on ships during the Revolutionary War,
Yeah.
the early struggles with recruitment and seeing their first action,
Mm-hmm.
to the formal reestablishment of the modern Corps and those really powerful traditions that came about.
Like the Mameluke sword and the leatherneck nickname.
Exactly. And the origins of the Marines are really tied to the birth and growth of the U.S. itself.
Absolutely. They're intertwined.
Yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The Marine Corps, they always celebrate their birthday as November 10th, 1775.
Yeah.
Even though the formal reestablishment was later in 1798,
Right.
it just shows how important that first spark of their creation during the Revolution is to their identity.
That moment means a lot to them.
It does, yeah. And the fact that they were doing amphibious landings
Yeah.
within months of being created
That's fast.
really says something about their purpose right from the very beginning.
Yeah, they knew what they were supposed to do.
Right.
And they're ready to do it.
Yeah, so understanding these origins really gives you context for a lot of things.
Like what?
Oh, the dedication, the discipline, the unique character.
The things we associate with Marines today.
Exactly. And their early role as both sea and land fighters.
Right.
And their connection to the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
It really laid the foundation for their versatility.
And their ability to go anywhere.
Right. With the expeditionary nature, which is still so important today.
It's amazing how much of that goes back to those early days.
It really does, yeah.
Yeah.
And that emphasis on readiness and taking action,
Mm-hmm.
that's a thread that runs through their whole history.
It's in their DNA.
It really is.
So it makes you think,
What's that?
with all these beginnings, and how much warfare has changed over the years,
Right.
how have those identities and traditions from back in the 18th and 19th centuries
Mm-hmm.
shaped their role today?
In a completely different world.
In a completely different world, yeah.
Yeah.
Are those old values still relevant in today's world?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's something to think about as you continue to explore the story of this organization.
It really is. It's an amazing story.
It is a great story.
Yeah.